The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Guardsman William Thompson took his position at the main gate. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, each golden button polished to mirror brightness, the ceremonia. Rifle rested against his shoulder with practiced precision, and his famous bearskin hat added nearly a foot to his already impressive height of 6 feet 2 inches. William came from a long line of soldiers. His grandfather had fought in World War II, defending London during the Blitz when German bombs fell like deadly rain. His father had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, keeping peace in dangerous streets where violence could erupt. At any moment, William carried on the family tradition, standing guard at one of Britain's most important royal residences. The morning started quietly, with only a few early tourists wandering through the castle grounds. William appreciated these peaceful moments before the crowds arrived. He could focus on his duties without constant distractions from curious visitors trying to make him smile, laugh, or break his military bearing. As the clock struck 9, tour buses began arriving from London. Groups of excited visitors poured out, cameras ready, guidebooks in hand. Most tourists showed proper respect for the historic location and the guards who protected it. But William had learned during his 3 years of service that there were always exceptions to good behavior. Among the morning visitors was a family from Texas. The father wore a large cowboy hat and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. His name was Brad Mitchell, and he seemed to believe that talking loudly made his opinions more important. His wife walked beside him with the patient expression of someone who had spent 20 years trying to quiet her husband in public places. There. 2 children showed different levels of interest in their surroundings. The teenage son was glued to his phone, taking selfies and posting them online. The daughter, about 16 years old, carried a thick guidebook and seemed genuinely fascinated by the castle's 1,000-year history. "Look at all this fancy stuff," Brad announced to anyone within hearing distance. "Must cost taxpayers a fortune to keep up all this medieval nonsense. Good thing America got rid of kings and queens 200 years ago." His wife Susan gently touched his arm. "Honey, maybe we should keep our voices down. This is their country, after all." "Hey, I'm just making observations," Brad replied, his voice getting even louder. "Freedom of speech, right? That's something we Americans understand better than most people." William remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the horizon beyond the gathering tourists. His training had taught him to ignore distractions and maintain absolute composure no matter what happened around him. The uniform he wore represented centuries of British military tradition, and he would not dishonor it by responding to ignorant comments from visitors. But Brad Mitchell was just getting started. He noticed the guards' complete stillness and seemed to interpret it as weakness rather than professional discipline. "Look at this guy," he said, pointing directly at William. "Standing there like a statue. Bet he can't even think for himself." Other tourists began to notice the loud American's behavior. Some looked uncomfortable and moved away, while others seemed curious about what would happen next. A small crowd started to form around William's position, creating an unwanted audience for what was becoming a very one-sided confrontation. "You know what I think?" Brad continued, encouraged by the attention. "I think this whole Royal Guard thing is just a big show. These guys probably couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. All ceremony, no real substance." His daughter looked up from her guidebook with a worried expression. "Dad, it says here that the Queen's Guards are actual soldiers who have served in real wars." "Maybe we shouldn't know, please, sweetheart," Brad interrupted. "It's just tourist propaganda to make them seem more important than they really are. Look at him. Does he look like a real soldier to you?" William's jaw tightened almost invisibly, but he maintained his rigid posture. Behind his stoic expression, he was thinking about his 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendation for bravery under enemy fire. He remembered the weight of real weapons in combat situations, the responsibility of protecting his fellow soldiers, and the life-and-death decisions that had nothing to do with ceremony or tradition. The American tourist stepped closer, now only a few feet from William's position. "I bet you don't even know what real military service looks like, do you? This is all just dress-up time for tourists like us." Several British visitors in the growing crowd began to look visibly angry at the disrespectful display, An elderly gentleman wearing military medals on his jacket stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to intervene on behalf of the silent guard. "In my day, we respected our soldiers," the old veteran muttered to his wife, loud enough for others nearby to hear. But William's training held firm. He had sworn an oath to maintain his post with dignity and honor regardless of provocation. Breaking that oath would dishonor not just himself, but every guardsman who had stood at this position before him. He continued to stare straight ahead, showing no reaction to the increasing insults being directed at him. Brad. Mitchell seemed to interpret the guard's silence as confirmation of his theories about British military weakness. See, he can't even defend himself with words, let alone actions. This whole thing is just a tourist trap dressed up in fancy uniforms. The crowd around them had grown to about 20 people now, with tourists from various countries all drawn. By the spectacle, most seemed uncomfortable with the Americans' behavior. But the situation held a certain fascination that kept them watching to see what would happen next. What none of them knew was that among the morning visitors was someone who would soon change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. Someone who understood British military history better than almost anyone alive, and who was not bound by the same rules of silence that kept William Thompson standing at perfect attention despite the growing humiliation he was being forced to endure. The stage was set for a lesson in respect. History is the true meaning of strength that Brad Mitchell would never forget. Professor Margaret Whitfield had been giving historical tours of British military sites for over 20 years. At 63 years old, she was one of the country's most respected experts on military history and traditions. She had written 15 books about British armed forces, consulted for television documentaries, and had been honored by the Queen herself for her contributions to preserving military heritage. That morning, she was leading a small group of international visitors through Windsor Castle. Her group included 2 professors from Germany who were studying European military traditions, a historian from Japan researching British influence in Asia, and a retired American general who was writing a book about Allied military cooperation. During World War II, they had been examining the castle's defensive architecture when the loud voices near the main entrance caught their attention. Professor Whitfield watched with growing dismay as the American tourist continued his verbal assault on the motionless guard. "This is quite disturbing," whispered Dr. Klaus Weber, one of the German professors. "That man shows no understanding of military protocol or basic courtesy." General Robert Hayes, the retired American officer, shook his head in embarrassment. "I served alongside British forces for 30 years. That loudmouth doesn't represent the Americans I know and respect." Professor Whitfield dedicated her entire career to studying the courage and sacrifice of British soldiers throughout history. She had interviewed hundreds of veterans, researched countless battles, and had developed a deep appreciation for the discipline and honor that military service required. Watching this ignorant tourist mock a serving guardsman was more than she could tolerate. "Brad." Mitchell's voice grew even louder as more people gathered to watch the spectacle. "I bet this guy has never been in a real fight in his life. Joined the army just to play dress-up and impress the tourists." His wife looked increasingly embarrassed by her husband's behavior. "Brad, honey, maybe we should just take our pictures and move on to the next area." "No way," Brad replied firmly. "I want to make a point here about how these people really think about regular folks like us. They act all superior, but they're just government employees in fancy costumes." The crowd around them had grown to nearly 30 people now, with visitors from many different countries, all drawn by the developing confrontation. Most seemed to recognize that the Americans' behavior was inappropriate, but the spectacle held a certain fascination that kept them watching. Professor Whitfield could no longer remain silent. She stepped forward from her group, her authoritative presence immediately commanding attention from the surrounding tourists. Her voice, refined by decades of lecturing at Cambridge University, carried clearly across the courtyard. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Brad directly, but maintaining perfect politeness. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary about this guardsman." Brad turned to face her, clearly pleased to have found what he assumed would be another audience for his opinions. "Oh, hello there. I was just explaining to everyone how all this royal stuff is basically just theater for tourists. I see, Professor. Whitfield replied, her tone remaining courteous but carrying an undertone that suggested she was far from impressed by his analysis. And what, might I ask, qualifies you to make such definitive statements about British military traditions? The question caught Brad completely off guard. He had been expecting agreement, or at least passive acceptance of his views, not a direct challenge to his expertise. Well, I don't need to be some kind of expert to see what's obvious. This is all just show business. How interesting, Professor Whitfield said calmly. Because I've spent 43 years studying British military history, including the modern role and requirements of the Queen's Guard, perhaps we have different perspectives on what constitutes obvious. A murmur of interest ran through the crowd as people realized they were about to witness a very different kind of confrontation. Brad's confident expression began to show the first signs of uncertainty as he realized he might be facing someone who actually knew what she was talking about. Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but I know what I see, Brad said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive tone. A guy in a costume standing around doing basically nothing. Professor Whitfield smiled slightly, the expression of an experienced teacher who is about to deliver an important lesson. Allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm Professor Margaret Whitfield from Cambridge University. I've written extensively on British military history and currently serve as a consultant to the Ministry of Defense on ceremonial protocols and historical accuracy. The atmosphere in the crowd shifted noticeably as people realized they were witnessing an encounter between ignorance and genuine expertise. Brad's wife looked relieved that someone was finally challenging her husband's embarrassing behavior, while his daughter moved closer, clearly eager to learn from someone who possessed actual knowledge. Furthermore, Professor Whitfield continued, I notice you've made several assumptions about this young man's military experience and capabilities. Would you be interested to learn some facts about the Queen's Guard that might surprise you? Brad waved his hand dismissively, but his gesture lacked the confidence he had shown earlier. Facts, opinions, whatever.
Oh.
I still say this is all just tourist entertainment.
Well then,
the professor said with the patient tone of someone accustomed to educating the uninformed. Let me share some information that might broaden your perspective. First, every member of the Queen's Guard must complete the same basic military training as all British soldiers, followed by 6 additional months of specialized ceremonial training. Several people in the crowd leaned in closer, clearly interested in learning more about the traditions they were witnessing. Brad's daughter pulled out her phone to take notes, while his son finally looked up from his social media to pay attention to the conversation. Second, Professor Whitfield continued, approximately 70% of current Queen's Guard members have served in active combat zones, including Afghanistan, Iraq, and various peacekeeping missions around the world. A visible wave of surprise passed through the gathered tourists as they absorbed this information. Many had assumed, like Brad, that the ceremonial guards were purely decorative positions with no real military significance. Third, and perhaps most relevant to your comments about their combat capabilities, several current members of the Queen's Guard have been awarded medals for valor, including the Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, and the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross. Brad's face was beginning to show clear signs of discomfort as his confident assertions were systematically dismantled by someone with actual expertise. But Professor Whitfield was just getting started on her impromptu history lesson. Professor Whitfield was far from finished with her impromptu education session. The crowd had grown to over 40 people now, tourists from around the world gathering to witness what was becoming a fascinating clash between American arrogance and British knowledge. Since you seem particularly interested in questioning this guardsman's military credentials, Professor Whitfield continued, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent in lecture halls, perhaps you'd like to know about the selection process for the Queen's Guard. Brad shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his defiant stance. Look, professor or whatever, I'm sure they have some kind of training. But let's be realistic here. This is basically just a job for people who want to dress up and stand around all day. How fascinating. The professor replied with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with willful ignorance. Because the reality is quite different from your assumptions. The selection process for the Queen's Guard is among the most rigorous in the British military. She turned slightly to address the broader crowd, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share her expertise with genuinely interested listeners. Candidates must first complete basic military training with distinction. Then they undergo psychological evaluation to ensure they can maintain composure under pressure, exactly the kind of pressure this young man is demonstrating right now. Several people in the crowd glanced at William, who continued to stand at perfect attention despite the ongoing discussion about him. His professional bearing was becoming more impressive by the minute as the scope of his training and discipline became clear. They must also pass rigorous physical fitness tests, Professor Whitfield continued, including the ability to march for hours in heavy ceremonial uniform, maintain perfect posture for extended periods, and remain alert and ready to respond to any security threat that might arise. Brad's teenage daughter looked up from her phone, where she had been researching everything the professor said. "Dad, I'm finding articles here that confirm everything she's saying," says the Queen's Guard training is actually harder than regular Army training in some ways. "Don't believe everything you read on the internet, sweetheart," Brad replied. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Professor Whitfield smiled at the young woman's curiosity. "Your daughter is quite right to verify information, and I'm pleased she's finding corroborating sources. Perhaps she'd be interested to know that the ceremonial drill training alone takes 4 months to complete, with candidates practicing 8 hours a day to achieve the precision required for public duties." "But what's the point?" Brad protested, grasping for any way to maintain his position. "All that training just to stand still and look pretty for tourists?" "Now we're getting to the heart of the matter," Professor Whitfield said, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm of a true educator. "You see, you're making the fundamental error of assuming that ceremonial duties are the extent of their responsibilities." She paused dramatically, ensuring she had the full attention of her impromptu audience. "The Queen's Guard are fully operational. Soldiers responsible for the security of the royal family and royal residences. They carry loaded weapons, maintain constant surveillance of their surroundings, and are trained to respond instantly to any threat." General Hayes, the retired American officer in Professor Whitfield's original group, stepped forward slightly. "If I may add something, Professor? Of course, General, your perspective would be valuable." The general addressed Brad directly, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Son, I've worked with British forces in combat situations. Around the world, these ceremonial guards often rotate in from active duty assignments. The young man you've been insulting may very well have saved lives under enemy fire before taking this posting." Brad's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to give up entirely. "Okay, maybe they have some real military experience. Standing here like a statue still seems pretty pointless to me." Professor Whitfield exchanged a knowing look with General Hayes. "I think it's time for a brief history lesson about why these traditions matter, why this young man's discipline is actually quite extraordinary." She turned to face the full crowd, many of whom were now taking notes or recording videos of her impromptu lecture. The tradition of the Queen's Guard dates back over 350 years. To 1660, when King Charles II established the first regiments specifically tasked with protecting the monarchy. "These weren't ceremonial positions then," she continued, warming to her subject. "They were elite fighting units, drawn from soldiers who had proven themselves in battle. The tradition of absolute discipline, of maintaining one's post regardless of distraction or provocation, comes from very practical military necessity." Brad's wife Susan had been listening with growing fascination. "What kind of necessity, Professor?" "Excellent question. Royal guards faced constant threats from assassins, political enemies, and foreign agents. A guard who could be distracted, provoked, or drawn away from his post represented a potentially fatal security breach." She gestured toward William, who remained perfectly motionless throughout the discussion. "What you're witnessing here isn't meaningless tradition. It's the demonstration of a mental discipline that could mean the difference between life and death in a real security situation. The ability to maintain focus and composure while under pressure, to ignore distractions and provocations, to remain alert and ready for genuine threats while filtering out harmless, but annoying interruptions. These are advanced military skills that take years to develop. Several people in the crowd began to look at William with new respect, understanding for the first time that his stillness represented not emptiness, but incredible self-control and professional competence. Professor Whitfield could see that her lesson was having the desired effect, but she had saved the best for last. She was about to reveal something about the specific guardsman they had been discussing that would completely transform Brad's understanding of who he had been insulting. For the past 20 minutes, Professor Whitfield paused in her historical explanation and pulled a small leather folder from her handbag. The crowd watched with curiosity as she opened it to reveal an official-looking identification card and several official badges. "I should mention," she said casually, "that in addition to my academic work, I also serve as a historical advisor to the Ministry of Defense. Part of my role involves maintaining records of serving personnel who have distinguished themselves in both combat and ceremonial duties." Brad Mitchell felt a growing sense of unease as the professor's credentials continued to expand beyond what he had initially realized. Around him, the crowd was hanging on every word, clearly fascinated by this unexpected encounter between ignorance and expertise. "Which brings me to something rather interesting about this particular guardsman," Professor Whitfield continued, looking directly at William Thompson, who maintained his rigid posture despite being the subject of discussion. She consulted a small notebook from her pocket. "I make it a point to familiarize myself with the service records of guards stationed at locations I visit regularly. It helps me provide accurate information to the visitors on my tours." General Hayes, the retired American officer, moved closer with obvious interest. "Professor, are you saying you know this young man's military background?" "Indeed I do, General. And I think our loud American friend might find the details quite illuminating." Brad tried to maintain his dismissive attitude, but his earlier confidence was clearly wavering. "Look, I don't care what his paperwork says. I still think this whole thing is just for show." "How fortunate, then," Professor Whitfield replied with a slight smile, "that we're not talking about paperwork, but about actual combat service and recognized heroism." The crowd pressed closer as they sensed something significant was about to be revealed. William's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but those close enough could see a slight tension in his jaw that suggested he knew what was coming. "Guardsman William Thompson," Professor Whitfield announced clearly, reading from her notes, "served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan with the Parachute Regiment before joining the Queen's Guard 3 years ago." A murmur of impressed surprise rippled through the gathered tourists. Brad's daughter looked up at her father with wide eyes, while his wife covered her mouth in obvious embarrassment at her husband's earlier comments. During his second tour, the professor continued, "Guardsman Thompson's unit came under heavy enemy fire during a rescue operation in Helmand Province. When his commanding officer was wounded, Thompson took command and led a successful evacuation of 4 injured soldiers under intense Taliban attack." The crowd was now completely silent, hanging on every word of this unexpected revelation. Eight's face had gone noticeably pale as the implications of his earlier insults began to sink in. For his actions that day, Professor Whitfield said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with perfect clarity, "A Guardsman Thompson was awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry in the face of enemy fire." General Hayes stepped forward, his expression showing the deep respect one military professional holds for another. "Professor, did you say the Military Cross?" "That's one of Britain's highest awards for combat valor." "Quite correct, General. It's awarded only for acts of exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy." Brad Mitchell stood frozen, the full weight of his ignorant comments now crashing down on him. For 20 minutes, he had been publicly mocking and insulting a decorated war hero who had risked his life to save others in combat. His teenage daughter looked up from her phone, where she had been frantically researching the Military Cross. "Dad, it says here that fewer than 2,000 of these medals have been awarded since World War II. This is really, really serious." Professor Whitfield wasn't finished. "There's more to Guardsman Thompson's record than our American. A friend might find educational." She turned a page in her notebook. "After returning from Afghanistan, he volunteered for additional training in close protection duties. He's qualified in counter-terrorism operations, crowd control, and emergency response procedures. He also speaks 3 languages fluently. She continued, holds advanced certifications in first aid and emergency medicine, and has completed specialized training in diplomatic security protocols. Brad's wife Susan stepped closer to her husband and whispered urgently, "Brad, you need to apologize right now. You've been insulting a war hero." But Professor Whitfield held up a hand to indicate she wasn't quite finished with her educational presentation. "There's one more thing that I think demonstrates the true character of this young man." The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that the most important revelation was yet to come. Last year, during his off-duty time, Guardsman Thompson organized and led a charity expedition to climb Mount Snowdon to raise money for wounded veterans. The expedition raised over £50,000 for the Help for Heroes Foundation. General Hayes shook his head in admiration. This soldier represents everything that's best about military service: courage in combat, dedication to duty, and service to his fellow veterans. The crowd around William began to shift, their earlier casual curiosity transforming into genuine respect and admiration. Several people started taking pictures, but now their photos were motivated by respect rather than mere tourist interest. "Professor." Whitfield closed her notebook and looked directly at Brad Mitchell. "So, to summarize for our American friend, the young man you've spent the last 20 minutes calling a toy soldier and suggesting couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag is actually a decorated combat veteran who risked his life to save others, continues to serve his country with distinction, and volunteers his personal time to help fellow veterans." The silence that followed was deafening. Brad stood rooted to the spot, his earlier arrogance completely deflated by the crushing weight of reality. Round him, 40 people from various countries had witnessed his ignorance being systematically destroyed by facts, expertise, and the truth about the man he had chosen to mock. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Brad Mitchell stood motionless, his face cycling through various shades of red as the full magnitude of his embarrassment settled over him. Round him, 40 tourists from different countries had just witnessed one of the most complete public humiliations anyone could remember seeing. His wife Susan finally broke the silence. "Brad," she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve, "you need to say something. You need to apologize." But Brad seemed paralyzed by the enormity of his mistake. For 20 minutes, he had publicly mocked and insulted a decorated war hero, making assumptions based on nothing more than his own ignorance and prejudices. Every word he had spoken now echoed in his memory with devastating clarity. His teenage daughter, Sarah, looked up from her phone with tears in her eyes. "Dad, how could you say those things? How could you be so mean to someone who risked his life for other people?" Professor Whitfield watched Brad's internal struggle with the patient expression of an educator who had delivered difficult lessons. Before, she understood that true learning often required a moment of profound discomfort, and she was willing to give him time to process what he had learned. General Hayes, the retired American officer, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all learned something important here today about the dangers of making assumptions about people we don't know." He looked directly at Brad. "As a former military officer myself, I want to say that Guardsman Thompson's behavior throughout this entire incident has been exemplary. His discipline, his composure, and his dedication to duty represent the finest traditions of military service." Several people in the crowd began to nod in agreement. Elderly British gentleman wearing Royal Navy veteran pins on his jacket spoke up. "That young man has shown more strength and character in the last 20 minutes than most people demonstrate in a lifetime." William Thompson continued to stand at perfect attention, his eyes fixed on the horizon, showing no reaction to the discussion. Swirling around him, his professional bearing remained flawless, despite having just been publicly defended and praised by experts and veterans. Brad's son, who had been largely ignoring the entire situation while focused on his phone, suddenly looked up with surprise. "Dad, this is going viral. Someone posted a video of the whole thing and it's already got like 50,000 views." "What?" Brad's voice cracked slightly as he spoke his first word in several minutes. "Yeah, look," his son said, holding up his phone screen. "Someone filmed the professor explaining about the military cross and everything. The comments are, well, They're not very nice about what you said. Susan Mitchell closed her eyes in dismay. Brad, this is a disaster. Everyone's going to see this. Professor Whitfield overheard the family's conversation and felt a moment of sympathy for their distress. While she believed Brad had needed to learn this lesson, she didn't want to see a family destroyed by one man's ignorant behavior. Perhaps, she said gently, this could be a moment for growth rather than just embarrassment. Brad finally found his voice, though it was much quieter and less confident than before. I don't know what to say. I was completely wrong about everything. Yes, you were, Professor Whitfield agreed simply,
Oh.
but recognizing that as the first step toward doing better. She gestured toward William, who maintained his stoic posture despite being the center of attention. This young man has shown remarkable grace under pressure. He could have responded to your insults, could have broken protocol to defend himself, but he chose to maintain his dignity and his duty instead. That level of self-control and professionalism, General Hayes added, is what real strength looks like. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 60 people now, with new arrivals quickly being filled in on what they had missed. The story was spreading through the castle grounds as tourists shared what they had witnessed. Brad took a shaky step closer to William's position. Guardsman Thompson, he said quietly, his voice barely carrying to the nearest spectators. Williams. Training required him to maintain his post and not respond to tourists, but the change in the American's tone was unmistakable. Where there had been mockery and arrogance before, there was now genuine remorse and respect. I owe you an apology, Brad continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. I said terrible things about you based on nothing but my own ignorance. I was wrong about everything, and I'm deeply sorry. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, recognizing that this was a significant moment of personal growth for the loud American who had started the entire confrontation. Professor Whitfield nodded approvingly. That's a good start, Mr. Mitchell. But perhaps you might consider what you've learned here today and how it might change how you interact with people in the future. You're absolutely right, Brad replied, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by humility. I made assumptions about someone I didn't know anything about. I judged him based on what I thought I was seeing instead of trying to understand what I was actually looking at. His daughter Sarah stepped closer to him. Dad, maybe. We should learn more about the places we visit before we start criticizing them. Maybe we should learn more about everything before we start criticizing, Brad replied, looking directly at his daughter with an expression she had never seen before. Genuine shame, mixed with determination to do better. The crowd began to slowly disperse as people realized the confrontation had resolved into something more meaningful than mere entertainment. Many tourists took one last respectful look at William Thompson before moving on to continue their castle tours, now with a much deeper appreciation for the young man who stood guard there. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Professor Whitfield approached Brad Mitchell one final time. Her expression had softened from the stern authority she had displayed during her impromptu lecture to something more compassionate and understanding. Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly, I hope you don't mind if I share one more thought with you before you continue your visit. Brad looked up at her with the expression of someone who had just learned a very painful but necessary lesson. After everything you've taught me today, I'd like to hear whatever you have to say. What happened here today isn't really about British military traditions or American tourists, she began thoughtfully. It's about something much more fundamental. The importance of approaching the world with humility and curiosity rather than assumptions and judgments. She gestured toward William, who continued to maintain his perfect military bearing. That young man could have responded to your comments in many different ways. He could have broken protocol to defend himself, or allowed anger to compromise his professionalism. Instead, he chose to maintain his dignity and trust that the truth would speak for itself. There's a lesson in that for all of us, General Hayes added. Encounter. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. Brad nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of his error. I keep thinking about all the things I said, how wrong I was about everything. His wife, Susan, placed a supportive hand on his arm. The important thing is that you learned something today. We all did. Professor Whitfield smiled warmly. Growth. often requires uncomfortable moments, Mr. Mitchell. What matters is what you do with the knowledge you've gained. Sarah, Brad's daughter, had been quietly observing her father's transformation throughout the morning. Dad, maybe when we get home we could research more about the places we visit. Learn about their history and traditions before we go. That's an excellent suggestion, Brad replied, his voice still subdued but showing signs of genuine enthusiasm for the idea. Maybe we could even find some books by Professor Whitfield here. I'd be honored to recommend some reading material, the professor offered graciously. Understanding the historical context of what we see makes travel much more meaningful. They spoke. Other tourists continued to pass by William's position, but now there was a noticeable difference in how they behaved. Word of the morning's events had spread throughout the castle grounds. Visitors approached the guard with obvious respect and admiration, rather than casual curiosity. An elderly couple from Australia paused near William's position, and the husband quietly removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "Thank you for your service, son," he said softly. Though he didn't expect or receive a response, a group of schoolchildren from Germany, who had been told the story by their teacher, approached William's post with wide eyes full of awe, rather than the usual giggles and attempts to make him smile. Brad watched these interactions with growing understanding. He's not just standing there, is he? He's representing something much bigger than himself. Exactly, Professor Whitfield confirmed. He represents the sacrifice, discipline, and dedication of countless soldiers who have served throughout British history. Every person who shows him respect is acknowledging that legacy. General Hayes checked his watch and realized his own tour group needed to move on to their next scheduled location. "Professor, thank you for allowing me to witness your excellent educational work today, Mr. Mitchell. I hope you'll remember that the best travelers are those who approach new places with open minds and respectful hearts." Brad extended his hand to the retired American general. "Thank you, sir. I wish I had shown the respect for military service that you've demonstrated today." They shook hands, and General Hayes nodded approvingly. "One soldier to another, we learn from our mistakes and become better men because of them." Departed with Professor Whitfield's tour group, the Mitchell family found themselves alone near William's position. The morning that had started with loud arrogance and ignorant assumptions had transformed into something none of them had expected, a profound lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of strength. Brad stood quietly for several minutes, simply observing William's unwavering discipline. The guard's perfect posture, his steady breathing, his complete focus on his duties, all of it now seemed remarkable rather than meaningless. This wasn't just a man in a costume of military bearing. "Dad," Sarah said softly, breaking the contemplative silence, "I want to write about this in my travel journal. Not about the embarrassing parts, but about what we learned." "What did we learn?" Brad asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's perspective on the morning's events. Sarah thought carefully before responding. "We learned that real strength isn't about being the loudest person in the room, or putting other people down too. Make yourself feel important. Real strength is about discipline, service to others, and maintaining your dignity even when people are being mean to you." Her words hit Brad like a physical blow, but not an unpleasant one. It was the impact of truth, cleanly delivered by his own child who had watched him behave badly and then learned to do better. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart," he said quietly. "And I want you to write about all of it in your journal, including the embarrassing parts. Sometimes we need to remember our mistakes so we don't repeat them." Susan Mitchell had been taking pictures throughout their conversation, but now she put her camera away. "I think some experiences are more important to remember with our hearts than with our phones." As their visit to Windsor Castle continued, the Mitchell family found themselves approaching every exhibit, road, and every tradition with newfound respect and curiosity. They asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to explanations, and showed genuine appreciation for the history and culture they were experiencing. When they returned to their hotel that evening, Brad did something he hadn't done in years. He spent 2 hours researching British military history online. He read about the Military Cross, about the Parachute Regiment, about the long tradition of the Queen's Guard. Every piece of information made him more ashamed of his morning behavior and more impressed by William Thompson's grace under pressure. 3 days later, As the Mitchell family prepared to return to America, Brad made one final stop at Windsor Castle. He found William still at his post, still maintaining perfect military bearing, despite the constant stream of tourists passing by. This time, Brad approached with quiet respect. He didn't try to make the guard respond or break protocol. Instead, he simply placed a handwritten letter at the base of the guard post, weighted down with a small stone to prevent it from blowing away. The letter read, "Guardsman Thompson, I was the rude American tourist who insulted you 3 days ago. I want you to know that your professionalism and dignity taught me more about real strength and character than I learned in 50 years of life before that day. Thank you for your service to your country and for showing me what honor looks like. With deepest respect and sincere apologies, Brad Mitchell, Dallas, Texas, USA." As Brad walked away from the castle for the last time, he didn't look back to see if William had noticed the letter. That wasn't the point. The point was that he had learned something fundamental about respect, humility, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. 6 months later, place in her high school's international travel writing competition. She titled it "The Day My Dad Met a Real Hero." It became required reading for students planning educational trips abroad. The essay's final paragraph read, "Sometimes the most important lessons we learn while traveling have nothing to do with the places we visit and everything to do with discovering who we are when we're confronted with our own ignorance. My dad learned that day that real strength isn't about being loud or critical. It's about discipline, service, and maintaining dignity under pressure. But most importantly, he learned that it's never too late to recognize when you're wrong and choose to do better." William Thompson continued his service as a member of the Queen's Guard, never knowing the profound impact his silent professionalism had on one American family's understanding of respect, tradition, and the true meaning of strength. He simply stood at his post, day after day, representing the finest traditions of British military service with the quiet dignity that had been passed down through generations of by Professor Whitfield, eventually accumulated over 2 million views. But rather than becoming just another source of internet mockery, it evolved into something more meaningful, a teaching tool used by educators around the world to discuss the importance of approaching other cultures with respect and humility. And somewhere in Dallas, Texas, Brad Mitchell became known among his friends and colleagues as the man who learned the hard way that assumptions can be dangerous, that real heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that sometimes the most powerful response to ignorance and insults is simply standing tall, staying silent, and letting the truth speak for itself.